He who conquers others may be powerful, but he who conquers himself becomes untouchable. For no throne is higher than inner dominion, and no rebellion more dangerous than self-betrayal. He who conquers others may be powerful, but he who conquers himself becomes untouchable. For no throne is higher than inner dominion, and no rebellion more dangerous than self-betrayal. Fragments on Sovereignty, A. Valerian. Do you really believe you lost that woman because you weren't good enough? Or because you were too good in the wrong place? How many times have you called something love that in reality was just a power imbalance? Most men don't suffer from a lack of value. They suffer from interpreting behavior as emotion when they should be interpreting it as structure. In The Prince, Niccolò Machiavelli wrote, "Men in general judge more from appearances than from reality. All men have eyes, but few have the gift of penetration. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are." Apply this to modern relationships. Women do not respond to what you feel. They respond to what you uphold. Here are the 4 laws few men can handle accepting. You were conditioned to believe that being a good man naturally generates desire, that honesty creates attraction, that stability generates excitement, that loyalty builds intensity, that works at work, it works in business, it works in building a reputation, but it doesn't work the same way in the territory of attraction. And this is where many men begin to bleed energy without realizing it. Most interpret female interest as a response to character. It isn't. It's a response to positioning. There is a brutal difference between being valuable and being perceived as valuable. And that difference isn't in what you feel, it's in what you hold. Women don't respond to your internal intention. They respond to your external emotional structure. You can be honest, coherent, patient, available. But if that availability has no limits, it stops being a virtue and becomes predictability. And absolute predictability eliminates tension. Attraction needs contrast. It needs space. It needs calculated uncertainty. When everything is guaranteed, desire relaxes. Men confuse security with attraction. They are different things. Security maintains the bond. Attraction creates momentum. Have you noticed how everything feels intense in the beginning? Because there's still risk. She doesn't know if you'll invest. You don't know if she'll stay. There's emotional instability. And instability creates attention. When you quickly eliminate any risk, always replying, explaining everything, anticipating needs, you remove the field of tension. You call it maturity. The unconscious calls it predictability. And predictability, when there are no consequences, reduces perceived value. This isn't about cruelty. It's about dynamics. You might say, but I was being authentic. Yes, but authenticity without structure is just exposure. There's a phrase attributed to Machiavelli that many ignore in practice. Men judge more by appearances than by essence, because few have access to what lies behind. In relationships, it translates like this. What matters isn't how much you feel. It's how willing you appear to maintain your own boundaries. Attraction isn't a reward for kindness. It's a reaction to autonomy. When you structure your life in a way that her presence is desirable but not necessary, something shifts. When your routine doesn't revolve around her response. When your mood doesn't depend on her interest, when your energy doesn't fluctuate with her behavior, you become stable. And real stability is different from constant availability. Stability is firmness. Excessive availability is masked dependency. A woman may like the man who adapts too much, but she respects the man who doesn't need to adapt in order to remain. Most men try to win through accumulated effort, more messages, more explanations, more presence, more attempts to show value. But attraction doesn't grow through the accumulation of unilateral investment. It grows when there is a perception of choice. If she feels you are already fully secured, her effort drops, not out of malice, but because the human brain conserves energy where there is no risk of loss. This is the part few can tolerate accepting. The more you try to prove you're different, the more you place yourself in the position of a candidate. And candidates compete. Structured men choose. When you understand that attraction is not a moral system, but a system of perception and tension, you stop seeking approval. You start observing reciprocity. You start measuring consistency. You begin to accept that desire cannot be argued. And that hurts, because it means admitting that effort does not replace structure. It means recognizing that many times you were trying to build something that could only exist if it was already there. Attraction is not built through logic. It is revealed through reaction. And when you internalize that, something silent shifts. You stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" And you start asking, "Is there real structure here?" That is the first rupture. And few men can tolerate that truth, because it dismantles years of emotional conditioning. But once you see it, you will never interpret behavior as poetry again. There's a brutal difference between being accessible and being too accessible. The average man believes that showing constant interest is proof of maturity, responding quickly, always being ready, making space in his schedule, adjusting plans, explaining emotions. He calls it commitment. Her unconscious interprets it as a lack of scarcity, and anything that requires no effort to maintain loses psychological weight. Have you ever noticed how something only begins to have real value when it can be lost? This isn't romanticism, it's basic mental functioning. The human mind prioritizes what can slip away. When you are permanently guaranteed, you stop being a choice. You become part of the background. Many men confuse intensity with continuous investment. But one-sided investment creates structural imbalance. And constant imbalance doesn't generate admiration. It generates complacency. Machiavelli warned that a ruler who distributes favors excessively loses authority because he creates dependency in others and wear in himself. In relationships, it shows up like this. If you always resolve conflicts, if you always initiate conversation, if you always try to restore the connection, if you always maintain the emotional rhythm, you become the one sustaining the dynamic. And the one who sustains it always gets tired first. Women don't devalue men for being good. They devalue men who have no visible boundaries. Boundaries create edges. Edges create respect. Respect sustains attraction. Without edges, you spread yourself thin, and anything that spreads too much loses its shape. The most common mistake isn't loving too much. It's making yourself available before reciprocity proves consistent. You've probably lived this. At first, she invests. Then you invest more. She invests less. You compensate. She settles. You call it a phase. In reality, it's a structural adjustment. She tested how much you tolerate, and you taught her that you tolerate a lot. It wasn't conscious manipulation. It was pattern recognition. Always being understanding, always patient, always willing to talk, without consequence, that communicates something silent. I stay, even if you fluctuate. And when someone has guaranteed permanence, effort decreases. This isn't female malice. It's psychological economy. The question isn't whether you should show interest. The question is there proportional reciprocity? If there isn't, your availability becomes a subsidy. You start financing a dynamic where the return is unstable, and worse, you still believe you're being noble. There's a point where over-explaining becomes self-justification, where over-communicating becomes an attempt to control, where always being present becomes fear of absence, and fear is detected, not through words, through energy. The man who doesn't know how to walk away sends a dangerous message, I need this to work, and need is the opposite of attraction. When you begin to withdraw automatic availability, something interesting happens. Some women adjust, others disappear. And that is natural filtering. If the connection only existed because you were sustaining it, it wasn't connection. It was unilateral maintenance. Healthy availability is a choice. Unlimited availability is insecurity disguised as maturity. Few men can handle this truth because it requires restraint. And restraint hurts more than effort. It's easier to send the message, easier to explain, easier to insist. What's difficult is letting silence reveal the real level of interest. But in silence, emotional hierarchy appears. Who invests, who initiates, who misses, who moves. When you stop filling every gap, the structure becomes visible. And many men discover they were necessary but not desired. That distinction changes everything. Being necessary creates utility. Being desired creates attraction. And utility has never been synonymous with desire. When you understand this, you stop competing for relevance. You observe who invests without being prompted. And this shift seems small, but this is where the game begins to end. You call it she's complicated, but you rarely ask, who is allowing this to continue? Confusion rarely exists on its own. It is sustained by one side, and almost always it's the man who is willing to tolerate it longer. Look at the pattern. She oscillates, she shows interest, then cools off. She talks about the future, then acts in the present as if nothing is defined. You try to understand. You ask. You talk. You explain how you feel. You ask for clarity. And the more you ask for clarity, the more distant she seems to become. Why? Because desire is not activated by pressure for definition. Desire is revealed in the absence of pressure. When you demand definition too early, you reveal a need for security. And one-sided emotional security creates asymmetry. In practice, confusion functions as a tolerance test, not a conscious test, a structural one. She observes, even without realizing she's observing, how much you can handle. Do you accept vague answers? Do you accept recurring cancellations? Do you accept promises that never turn into action? Do you accept intermittent energy? Every time you accept, you teach. And what you teach is simple. I stay even in ambiguity. From that point on, ambiguity stops being a mistake. It becomes the pattern. Most men believe that insisting resolves confusion. In reality, insisting prolongs it. There is a brutal difference between giving space and begging for definition. Giving space is observing. Begging is trying to control her perception of you, and every attempt to control perception communicates fear of loss. Fear shifts power. When you stop asking, what's going on, and start asking, do I want to be where this is happening? The structure changes. You move from the position of emotional defendant to evaluator. That immediately alters the dynamic, because now the question is no longer whether she will choose you. It's whether you will choose to stay. Confusion is only comfortable when someone is willing to carry it. If you stop carrying it, two things happen. Either she adjusts her behavior or the connection collapses. And many men fear the collapse. They prefer months of uncertainty to a quick break. But a quick break hurts once. Constant confusion erodes you every day. There's something few admit. Some women maintain ambiguity because it offers emotional advantage. While you are trying to understand, she is evaluating options. While you are investing energy, she is measuring return. It's not villainy, it's unconscious strategy. Every human being preserves the most advantageous scenario available. If you remain present even in instability, you become a guaranteed scenario. And guaranteed scenarios don't create urgency. When you finally reduce your investment, something unsettling happens. She feels the shift before she understands it rationally. Because the energetic structure has changed. You are no longer seeking validation. You are observing coherence. And coherence is rarer than pretty words. Men who understand this stop arguing about mixed signals. They no longer interpret every message as an emotional clue. They observe patterns. Patterns don't lie. Words lie. Intentions can lie. Narratives can lie. Patterns don't. If consistency doesn't increase over time, there is no real investment. Accepting this eliminates half the emotional exhaustion most men live with. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Many relationships don't end because of incompatibility. They end because one side stops tolerating what it once accepted. And when you stop tolerating ambiguity, you stop feeding confusion. That's when the illusion begins to die, and few men can handle watching their own illusion collapse, because it means admitting that the confusion was never a mystery. It was prolonged choice. There is a silent moment that changes everything. It's not when you learn how to attract better. It's not when you discover the right lines. It's not when you understand the techniques. It's when you simply stop. Stop insisting. Stop initiating every conversation. Stop pushing for definition. Stop trying to restore something that is already unstable. And this stopping isn't dramatic. It's structural. Most men believe a connection dies when interest fades. A connection dies when one side stops carrying it alone. Chasing is carrying. When you chase, you maintain the rhythm. You create continuity. You prevent silence. You keep the real structure from being exposed. As long as you're running after her, you never find out whether she would walk toward you. Chasing masks the truth. Because when you're always the first to invest, you never see who would invest spontaneously. The man who stops chasing isn't playing games. He's observing. And observation is brutal, because it removes the narrative. No extra messages. No long explanations. No attempts to convince. Just behavior. And behavior doesn't lie. When you reduce your investment, two possible reactions emerge. First, she adjusts. She starts initiating conversations. She shows more clarity. She plans dates. She reduces ambiguity. That reveals genuine interest. Second, she disappears. No confrontation, no deep justification, no effort to maintain. That reveals dependence on your initiative. Notice the difference. Before, you interpreted every fluctuation as a phase. Now, you interpret it as information. Stopping the chase is removing the fuel. Many romantic dynamics function like a fire fed by constant validation. You feed it with attention. You feed it with presence. You feed it with explanation. Without fuel, what remains? Either there's a flame of its own, or it was just reacting to the heat you were providing. Few men can tolerate this test, because stopping the chase requires tolerating silence, and silence confronts insecurity. When you don't text, anxiety appears. When you don't fix things, doubt appears. When you don't insist, fear of losing appears. But here's the inversion. If something depends exclusively on your insistence to exist, it was never solid. It was artificial support. There's something even more uncomfortable. Many women don't consciously realize they're used to being pursued. It becomes part of the environment. Frequent texts, constant initiative, effort to maintain the vibe. When that disappears, disorientation appears. Not necessarily because she lost you, but because she lost predictability. And predictability is comfortable, even when the dynamic is weak. When you stop chasing, you remove automatic comfort. Now she has to decide. Move forward, or let it die. And decision requires emotional responsibility. That's why some men get labeled cold, distant, changed out of nowhere. In reality, they just stopped compensating. What changed wasn't interest. It was the level of tolerance. There's a brutal difference between abandonment and discernment. Abandonment is avoiding conflict. Discernment is refusing confusion. When you stop chasing, you're not punishing. You're filtering. Filtering is ruthless, but clean. It eliminates weeks of ambiguity. It eliminates months of overinterpretation. It eliminates invisible exhaustion. You begin to notice something curious. Whoever truly wants to be there moves. Whoever was only reacting to your energy dissipates. And that can hurt, because it means admitting that part of what you called a connection was simply a response to your investment. But it also liberates, because now you no longer have to convince anyone to stay. You simply observe who already is. The man who understands this doesn't become bitter. He becomes economical. And emotional economy is real maturity. He invests where there is proportional return. He remains where there is consistency. He leaves where there is constant noise, no drama, no speeches, no excessive explanation, just action. Stopping the chase reveals a truth many avoid. Genuine interest does not need to be extracted. It manifests. And when you internalize this, something irreversible happens. You stop chasing answers. You stop competing for attention. You stop trying to prove your value. You observe. And choosing to observe instead of chase is the point where the game ends. Because the game only existed as long as you agreed to play. After you understand these 4 laws, something changes permanently. You don't become more aggressive. You don't become manipulative. You don't become distant as a strategy. You become selective. And selectivity completely changes the field. You stop measuring your value by her response. You stop interpreting silence as rejection. You stop turning inconsistency into some deep mystery. You begin to treat behavior as data. And data doesn't ask for emotional explanations. It asks for decisions. Most men live trying to adjust their own behavior to maintain interest. You've done that. Changed your posture. Changed your intensity. changed your communication, even changed your personality. But you never asked yourself, if I have to reshape myself to keep this, what exactly am I keeping? When you understand that attraction is structural, that excessive availability erodes value, that confusion is sustained, and that pursuit masks the truth, you no longer enter the cycle. You observe. And observing is uncomfortable because it eliminates fantasy. There's no more maybe, no more what if I do it differently, no more she just needs time. There is pattern, and pattern is cold, but liberating. You begin to realize something few men admit out loud. Much of the emotional exhaustion didn't come from women. It came from insisting on staying where the signals were already clear. When you stop insisting, the world doesn't become empty. It becomes clean. No noise. No inflated expectations. No romantic narrative about potential. You start investing where there is natural reciprocity, where effort is mutual, where energy returns. And interestingly, that's when lightness appears. Not because it became easier, but because it became readable. Most men don't suffer from a lack of opportunities. They suffer from a lack of filters. And filters require courage. The courage to leave without a long explanation. The courage not to respond immediately. The courage to accept that not every connection deserves depth. After that, you no longer argue about women are like this or men are like that. You understand dynamics, and dynamics aren't personal. They're structural. The real question isn't whether they will react differently. The question is, will you still behave the same way now that you know? If you made it this far, you've probably lived through at least one of these cycles. I have too. I've over-explained. I've invested beyond what was proportional. I've tried to save something that was already leaning. I've confused intensity with depth. And understanding these structures didn't make my life more romantic. It made it more honest. Sometimes quieter, sometimes lonelier in the short term, but far more stable in the long run. Understanding dark psychology doesn't make you happier. It makes you less naive. And being less naive means being less manipulable. So if this made you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is a sign that an old belief has started to crack. If you want to keep dismantling comfortable illusions, subscribe. Not to learn how to conquer, but to learn how to see. Because once you see, you can't pretend you didn't.